I'm James Swallow, games writer and writer of stuff. And with me is my sterling comrade, Ms. Rhianna Pratchett.
Jim and I have known each other for since we were both games journalists, actually, so it's got to be a good 9-10 years.
Thanks for reminding me, Rhi. Thank you so much.
And weirdly, we've never actually worked together. I think we've kind of been recommended each other for projects. We've never actually worked together.
We've come close a couple of times, but we've never actually worked together. That's probably why we get on so well.
And that's one of the things we'll be emphasising during the talk is the importance of networking and knowing people. And so many of the jobs certainly that I've had, and maybe the same for Jim, have been through contacts I've made,
Totally.
friends, recommendations, colleagues I've worked with. It's so important. I've had contacts that have taken 10 years of kind of good hard friendship and that have actually turned into work. So this is still seems to be a relatively small industry. I don't know if that's because we're quite kind of a subsection of it. Yeah.
It's true. I think that there was not so much maybe true now, but there was a point where we were getting together and drinking in a pub in Islington, and one of us remarked that if a bomb went off here, that would be the end of the British games writing industry because we were all in one room.
That still happens though.
That could still. Now we just get bombed rather than getting bombed. Before we kick off, actually, there's a thing I always like to do whenever I do a thing where we're at a panel talking about games writing. Is sometimes it's difficult to gauge the knowledge level of the kind of audience that we have. Sometimes we have people who are casual gamers or hardcore gamers. And I tried many times to try and come up with a way that would be a good gauge for this. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say a number of sentences, and I'd like to see a show of hands if you know what I'm talking about. The cake is a lie. I used to be an adventurer, but I took an arrow to the knee. It's too dangerous to go alone, take this. Good, okay, that's a great... And see, that is the perfect litmus test for the kind of the knowledge level of our audience, and you guys have all passed with flying colours, so awesome. We don't have to dial it down.
Okay, should we start off talking about how each of us got into this business?
Let's do that.
It's similar routes, isn't it? Because I used to be a game journalist, so I've been a gamer since I was about 6 years old. Initially starting with strategy games, actually. They were my first love, and adventure games as well, and then kind of moving into RPGs when I got a job at PC Zone, partly because I think that was a genre I didn't have to fight all the lads for, and I think it was secretly considered a respectable genre for a lady. So I got a lot of RPG work there, and also ended up working at The Guardian as well. So from about 2000 to 2002, 2003, I was doing a lot of games journalism work. And then one of the contacts that I had made during my journalism time, a studio called Larian Studios in Belgium, contacted me asking if I was interested in a story editor job for a game with a terrible name called Beyond Divinity, which is a kind of a sequel to a game with an even worse name called Divine Divinity. And I didn't really know much about games writing. No one was really talking about it. I assumed people were doing it, but they were just very quiet about it. And it was behind the scenes in their writer boxes, and they weren't really let out. So I didn't know much about it when I went in. And it pretty much put me off hardcore RPGs for about the next decade, until I started I did some work on Risen. But I came out of it and I thought, this seems to be some kind of career, and I'll see if I can get more work in this field. So I hit up the contacts I'd made as a journalist and said, I'm doing narrative work now, do you think you've got any work for me? And it just so happened I got a few people at the right time and managed to build up my portfolio from there. So going from things like, I did level design on a SpongeBob game, I said level dialogue, sorry, on a SpongeBob game and a Pac-Man game, and
Not so much dialogue with that, really.
Well, you'd be surprised, actually. Very talkative Pac-Man. And then moving into kind of mission design for a strategy game called Stronghold Legends, and then sort of finally taking on Heavenly Sword, which was my first big AAA game, and then sort of moving it on from there. And now I've had the good fortune to work on games such as Mirror's Edge, Tomb Raider most recently, the Overlord games, which I have a real soft spot for, and then all sorts of games helping out other writers as well, like BioShock Infinite, like Risen, like Prince of Persia as well, so sort of helped out Andrew Walsh, who's another friend of ours, and was also a games writer with that. So I've worked on quite a few different types of games. I've just got an indie game out at the moment called Beat Buddy, which is I usually steer away from what I call narrative paramedic jobs, and you and I will be talking about the art of narrative paramedicing as it exists in the games industry at the moment. And I tend to steer away from those kind of jobs. But I returned to narrative paramedicing for Beat Buddy, which was a little indie title, the first indie title I'd worked on for a while. So yes, and it's available on Steam now, so just a little bit of promotion, it's really good fun. And yeah, that's kind of what I do every day. I also work do some TV and film, I've done some comic work, short stories, non-fiction, but primarily I work freelance, so I'm not an in-house person like, for example, BioWare writers or Bethesda writers. So I come in and help out an existing team at different stages of the project and work with them to help create the narrative, the world, the storyline of the characters, and then eventually write the script. Usually the main thematic script, and sometimes rolling into things like level dialogue and like box.
Well, in terms of the job I do, it's exactly the same as the one that Rhi's just described there. External game writer probably is the term that's used the most. How I got into the industry, I used to write game reviews for a lot of media magazines, so like kind of SFX and Starlog and stuff like that, and a few of the sci-fi tie-in magazines. And at the time I was working for the official Star Trek tie-in magazine. And I'd gone to a game show where they were demonstrating the newest Star Trek titles, and they had a bunch of guys there from a developer who just started work on a Star Trek game. And I said, this is really interesting. And they showed me the research material they were using, and I said, that's great, I wrote that. We should probably hire you. And so that, purely by accident, I'd been interested in games all my life and played a lot of video games, and I kept thinking to myself, I'd really like to write some dialogue for these because the dialogue's not that great and I'm sure I could do a better job. And this opportunity fell into my lap. That game was Star Trek Invasion for the PlayStation 1, and that was 1999, and since then I've pretty much done, I think, maybe like one game job a year. I do a lot of other stuff. I also write radio scripts. I've worked on tie-in books for Doctor Who, Star Trek, Warhammer 40,000, a bunch of other stuff. But I kind of tend to divide my time between prose writing and games writing. After I worked on Star Trek Invasion, I worked on a Battlestar Galactica tie-in game for the Xbox and PlayStation 2. I worked on a real-time strategy game for Codemasters called Maelstrom. Please don't play it, it's really awful. If you do, you'll actually find me voice acting in it. We had in a bid to save money, they decided that they would get me to direct the voice acting because I'd already written the script. And some of the actors didn't turn up, so I had to record an awful lot of the barks. You know, the kind of thing where you click on a guy and he's like, yes, sir, I'm on my way. You'll hear that voice a lot. And you know, but it's great. I get to play that game and kill myself by driving myself off a cliff. So that was Maelstrom. I worked on a very early iteration of Killzone 2. I did some development work on an early version of Crysis 2, a lot of sequels. More recently, I worked on Deus Ex Human Revolution, which was the first big AAA title I worked on. And that was a great experience because I didn't have to do the narrative paramedic job that Rhi was talking about. I got involved from very early on and got heavily invested in that game. I also worked on Fable the Journey, the Kinect title, and most recently I worked on Deus Ex The Fall, which is a parallel title for Human Revolution for Android and iOS. And also a bunch of other titles that I can't talk about that got cancelled or horribly spiked, but that's also part and parcel of our job, really.
Do you feel most comfortable working on SF titles?
I'm an SF writer, so yeah, I guess so. I mean, I think if, you know, I know those tropes best. I mean, I did Fable, because Fable's a high fantasy title. I did that for two reasons, mostly because one, I didn't have any decent fantasy titles on my CV, so people thought I could only do science fiction. And it was a Kinect title. And I wasn't really fully convinced by the idea of motion control as a device for us to use as storytellers. So I wanted to see how that worked. I wanted to kind of peek underneath the hood. So I think it was a useful experience for that. I'd really like to do some modern titles. I'd love to do a brainless racing game, you know, because I like fast cars. That's very much. I'd like to do a couple of boys' toys games. I'd like to do a kind of Call of Duty style balls out, blow shit up game, and I'd like to do a racing car game, and then maybe something really indie and thoughtful, just to prove that I have range, you know.
Yeah, that's about. I'd love to do indie and thoughtful, but I always find that no one ever asks me to. Like, it's Anthony Johnson, who's another games writer, and I were lamenting about this on Twitter actually, because when you get involved with the AAA scene, which I have, just that's because that's the way that things have panned out. You never kind of get asked to do the indie and thoughtful ones. Not that AAA can't be thoughtful.
Because they think you're too grand for indie, maybe.
Maybe, yeah. Or they just like with Beat Buddy, they thought about me, and they sort of they said drafted an email and thought, then that she'll never be interested. We won't ask, and it was only because I was got friendly with Austin Wintory at a conference, and Austin's very good at looking at Kickstarter campaigns and stuff and offering his stuff and maybe being a stretch goal. And I said, hey, can you keep an eye out for any interesting indie titles that you think could benefit from my experience? And he pointed me in the direction of Beat Buddy, and there's a little team called Threeks in Germany, and they were sort of in a real pickle with their story, and the guy who wrote it was the art director, and he didn't really know much about writing, and he was losing sleep over it, and they were in a bit of a panic, and they didn't know what to do, and so it was a real narrative paramedic job. And when we say that, we mean kind of the story's in such a state that all you can do is basically patch up where it's bleeding.
It's circling the drain at that point.
And I did a full script rewrite on it, and I sort of rethemed their story as much as I could within the parameters. Obviously everything was designed, all the elements that were in place for the levels and the gameplay, and so I had to kind of work with what was there, which actually was quite an interesting challenge, and I quite relished doing it. It didn't take that long because there wasn't that long to do it in, so I think I rewrote the script in a few days and sort of helped restructure the story and do things like look over the menu screens and stuff like that in a few weeks. But it was actually quite a lot of fun because it was a good sort of test of skills and working within those boundaries that we have to do in games so often. And it was also text as well, so that it was even more limited in that regard. But it was quite a good experience in looking at how stories are put together, and actually you can do something quite quickly if you kind of know the structure of things. And with Beat Buddy, it's a game about music, it's a game about interacting with music, but the story, when I came in, wasn't about music. And one of the first things I said to them was, guys, you need a story about what the player's doing, because that is the story. And then I helped create them not a particularly in-depth story about kind of music and musical beings and things like that, and that sort of framed what they were doing with the gameplay. So that's the kind of same working practices I would take in on AAA titles, looking at what the player is doing on a moment-to-moment basis and look at how that informs character and story.
The whole idea of the narrative paramedic thing is, unfortunately, there tends to be two ways that you get to approach a games project as a writer, and the worst way, and unfortunately still the way that it happens a lot, is you'll get a call and they'll say, can you come in and look at our script, and you find that the game's already been made, that the levels are already there, that they already have a storyline, and they've gotten to the point where they're almost about to take the CD to the pressing plant, and they go, actually, our dialogue's a bit crap and the story doesn't make any sense. And they bring you in, and it's the equivalent of saying, can you sprinkle your magical writer pixie dust on this and make it not crap? And you can't polish a turd. Unfortunately, there are times when this narrative just doesn't make sense, so you have to try and shoehorn in and hammer in dialogue that makes some vague sense and some kind of vague attempt at a narrative, and that's why next time you play a game where the narrative doesn't make sense, stop and think about what I just said, because it may not actually be the fault of the writer. It might be the writer who's handed this dog's dinner and gone, oh, for God's sake, how am I going to make this make sense? That's the worst example. That's the narrative paramedic situation. The best example is when you get brought in at a nice early stage when maybe the developer has the key concepts in mind. They have an idea of what style of game it's going to be. They have an idea of the texture. Maybe they have some artwork. And they have an idea of the direction. And then you can truly bring your energy to the game. You can truly contribute as a writer and help them develop the world working on the not just the narrative, but on the the development of the characters, the development of the key factions in the world, even the environments, giving character to those, even down to the smallest details. Writing description text for weapons or equipment or pieces of hardware, everything that gives character to and life to the world. That, I feel, is a way that a writer can contribute really, really well. And of course, if you're brought in early, you also get to meet the other guys, the level designers, the art guys. Everybody gets to kind of put their energy together, and hopefully at the end of it, what you get is a nice synergistic project that everybody's been well involved in. That's the way we like to work. Unfortunately, it's not always the way we get to work.
I mean, I like to have quite a long time before I'm actually writing any script, ideally. There's so much that you need to do with world building and character building and creating bibles of the world and characters. And it's all about sort of building the iceberg, even if what the player sees and experiences in the game is the tip. You still, as a writer or as a narrative designer, have to build that iceberg so that everything that holds up that tip is true and is thought out. You don't really get much space and agency in games to necessarily tell the story you want or flesh out the characters the way you like, but there can often be other avenues as well that you can use all that pages and pages that you put together about what the pets were called and things like that can come in useful. And for example, both on Mirror's Edge and Tomb Raider, I wrote prequel comics for both of the stories, with Dark Horse for Tomb Raider, with DC for Mirror's Edge, and those allowed me to kind of explore the world and the characters and the setup to the story in a bit more detail than I could in the game. Obviously, with comics, especially if they're sort of script-led comics, it's narrative-led and you're not having to think about gameplay or shooting people in the face at any point. And so it can be really useful for that. And that's becoming quite trendy at the moment, tie-in comics, novels and things like that. Novels have been going for a while, but comics have taken more of a resurgence.
Yeah, definitely.
In the last 5 years.
I think there's a phrase that we used to talk about, invisible writing, but I heard a really great description actually by the writer of Pacific Rim, Travis Beacham, who talked about narrative dark matter, as in, you can see it's there, you can't see it's there, but you can feel the gravitational influence of it on everything else. And it's the idea of creating material that you as gamers probably will never see. So we write backstories, like as Rhi was saying, we describe a character, we talk about what the name of their first pet was, just like where they grew up, what their life was like. You probably won't come across that. Maybe it might be dropped in the game somewhere as readable or a file you might find. But the idea is that informs everybody who has a handle on that character. And if we're talking about a development cycle that can be 3 or 4 years, it's very important to have an idea of who is your lead character, who is your villain, who are your supporting characters. It's just the same level of detail that, if you were creating an epic novel, you would put in for that. And it allows the art guys to kind of read this and say, well, hey, you've described this character this way, and so that's going to influence the art style. And then that art can influence the writing. In the same way that when we were creating Deus Ex, we had a particular boss character that I'd written the backstory for. The art guy showed me the artwork, which was very different from the approach that I'd made. And I said, well, this is really interesting what you've done here. I'll change what I've done. And then we handed that on to the guys who were developing the character's animation. And the style of the character affected the way that character would move through the environment. So everybody's adding something to it. And at the end, you get this composite that is built on all of this information that the gamers probably will never see, but is there, like the iceberg, suspending all of this narrative and giving you a sense of a larger and richer world, even if you're not aware that stuff is kind of bubbling away under the surface.
Should we open it to questions? We're happy to.
We could blab on all night about how great it is at working at games and how fabulously talented we both are. But guys, feel free to jump in with any questions that you may have.
If you're brought into a game early and you have a lot of input, as you were talking about before, how the hell do you put the world that you're growing in your head into a usable format that a team of people of different disciplines can use? Do you have a central database? Do you build wikis? How do you do that at a practical level?
Yeah, for Deus Ex Human Revolution, we had a virtual private network set up with a dedicated Wikipedia for Deus Ex. So everybody had, there were limited layers of access about how much stuff you could change, but everything we wrote went into this document and it would be instantaneously changed. So there's a guy on the other side of the building who is now working on the art for character X, and I've just put up a document about that character's backstory. He now has perfect access to that. If he says, like, you know, this character can't have 3 legs, has to have 4, you know, that information goes back in there and it flashes backwards and forwards. So you have, that was a really useful tool to have. I don't think every project does. I think every project should. Other times it's just a question of trying to communicate your vision as clearly as you possibly can.
Yeah, I mean, I think on Tomb Raider we generally used story and character bibles, but no matter what you do, it's so hard to get people to read things. Like, especially if they're not they're not used to reading documents longer than 2 pages. It's so hard. Is that, you know, games writers go on and we haven't found a solution apart from sort of PowerPoint presentations, sorts of pictures. You know, putting together what we call ripomatics or
sizzle reels,
tone movies, which are kind of images from movies and TV set to music to try and sum up the tone of something. It is really hard to get people to read things, but you just kind of got to try and break it down as best you can. And it is essential to have all that information there, even if not everyone reads it. And usually, when you are working a narrative team, the different sections of the narrative will be broken down. So, for example, I often work on the cinematics, so I work on the core, usually quite linear storyline of a game. And then, for example, in Tomb Raider we had John Stafford, who's a narrative designer in-house, and he did a lot of the level design dialogue for Lara, because he was working with the team on site and he could sort of react to changes in the level design and the gameplay. And I would look over them to sort of check that Lara's voice sort of married together, and I did a little bit myself. And then he also wrote the barks for the enemies, so the short lines that you hear from the enemies. And sometimes that, again, barks can go to a completely different person as well. So that's something I worked on Infinite. So we had people like Ken and Drew doing the main story, and then we had other writers working on the level design like Christina, and then I was working on the AI dialogue. So you know, barks, but which are usually some of the most boring, most challenging parts of a game. But actually, on a Bioshock game, they're probably the most interesting barks in the business. But there's so much volume involved that it actually makes sense to have writers that are covering all those areas. And it is essential, even if it's just for the writing team, to have those central documents that everyone can read and have a look at, because the writers will read your stuff and the narrative designers will read your stuff. And you'll usually find some allies in every camp. So usually audio you tend to work with quite a bit, art a little bit, level design, if you can find narrative-friendly level designers, they're worth their weight in gold.
If it's more than one writer working on a project, often there'll be a narrative lead who kind of is the equivalent to what a showrunner would be doing if it was a television series. They might not be doing an actual lot of writing, but they're the person who is the keeper of the tone. That's the person who's holding the entire narrative in their head, the ideas of the characters. That's the guy or girl who go into the meeting and go, no, you're drawing that character wrong. And you as the writer will be writing the dialogue. You might not have to fight that battle. But the pressure of that communication is sometimes solely on that person. And so you have to find somebody who has the ability to communicate, like, as Rhi was saying, you know, whether it's through imagery or just through just standing up there and saying, this is why this character is cool. So that's kind of how you get it out of your head into the room. And of course the other thing is when you're working with a team, that's coming back the other way as well. So you can't be precious about it. And certainly very much so with video games, where sometimes, you know, at the last minute, entire sections of the game will be cut. You know, or you'll get something like, okay, this level was on a lava planet, now it has to be at the bottom of the sea. And all of your dialogue about, all of your great dialogue about using lava as a metaphor for the hero's romance has gone terribly wrong. Now it has to be dialogue about him drowning, and you have to change it overnight. And that will be because the technical piece of software that renders lava didn't work very well. But we've got a thing that can render water really, really well, so we'll do that. And you know, you'll find yourself dealing with those kind of positions, or you'll have, you know, stories suddenly truncated because the game has to come out a month earlier. So you have all of these different things all being thrown into the mix, on top of the fact that you actually have to try and craft a damn good story and compelling characters.
How do you, when writing, sort of take into account what the player is going to bring to the table? So thinking of Deus Ex specifically, with Adam Jensen, I sort of had to decide for myself where he'd draw the line on, okay, not going to kill them, I'm just going to sneak past all of them. They've got it coming, sort of style of thing.
With Deus Ex, the guys at Rock Paper Shotgun basically decided to do a playthrough of the game being the vicious and most evil they possibly can, just beating up people and blowing things up. We wanted to construct a game where if that's the way you wanted to play the game, you could play the game that way, and the game would support that. But we also wanted to construct the same game where if you wanted to play it in a relatively passive way, where you were using force and violence as minimally as possible, and still play your way through the game, that hopefully you could do that as well. How do we communicate the character? How do we, how can we say, if we have a cutscene with this guy saying like, well, I'm a nice, friendly person, and then you cut to gameplay and you're blowing the hell out of everything. There's going to be a kind of narrative disconnect there. So you can never truly predict 100% where the player's going to go. You can try and construct story in such a way of saying, this is kind of the way we'd like you to go, but if the player wants to play evil scumbag, they're going to play evil scumbag. So with the lead for Deus Ex, what we tried to do was we created a strong background for him. And so when you get hold of him at the beginning of the game and he's turned over to you as the player, we say to you, this is who Adam Jensen was. And he has, at the beginning of the game, he has a very traumatic event that happens to him. We say, where he goes from here is up to you. You decide who Adam Jensen is. We just tell you who he was. So hopefully, as you play through the game and you encounter cutscenes and you encounter bits of dialogue, we try our best to make it fit tonally. But it's a difficult line to walk, because if you make it too generic and too bland, there's no emotion. If you hew too much to one way or the other, somebody who's playing it in a different direction will feel that it just disconnects from them. There's no easy way to do it, short of writing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different variations of dialogue, which would take forever and need a team of 1,000 different writers. Maybe in the future we'll be able to build games with that level of narrative depth, but we're not quite there yet, I think. It's kind of a smoke and mirrors thing. We'll try and keep you in a position where the dialogue rings true to you, but it won't always ring true to every player. Hopefully to a large enough percentage that they'll enjoy it.
Did you do much dialogue consideration dependent on how the player was playing at various points?
There's some elements in the game where we had what we call conversational boss fights, where we had very intricate sort of choice dialogue elements where you could have conversations with different people and you could choose the kind of responses that you had, and then the character that you were talking to would respond in a different way, and that would lead off to another different thing. And what's fun about that, most people don't even notice it, because there's a whole lot going on underneath the hood, and for people it's just like that choice, this choice, that choice, and then they move on. So there, definitely we tried to change dialogue, because you could approach somebody and sort of like, hey, how are you doing? Or it's like, hey, you scumbag, or like, hey, do you want to come back to my place? Whatever. You could have all these different sort of approaches that you could put forward. So you could be the angry guy, you could be the suave guy, you could be sort of a bit sort of greasy and oily, sort of whatever kind of approach you wanted to make. And hopefully we could create a contiguous line of dialogue that if you looked at all of that dialogue in isolation, it would feel realistic. Did we succeed? I'm not really sure. But we tried really hard to.
It strikes me, games writing, as a developer myself, you're going to be writing a load of stuff that people are never going to read. And I think something like, say, Dylan Thomas as a poet would agonise for days over one word, knowing though that he's writing a poem, which is a page, which will be read. How do you approach it, knowing that actually, as you say, if it's a tree of dialogue, they probably will only see 10% of it or whatever?
I think it's the kind of art of structure, really. You can kind of reuse dialogue and fold things back in, and often you're also creating the illusion and smoke and mirrors of feeling like the world has gone in a different direction, but it's only angled off a bit and it's coming back to the direction the developers wanted to. So you're still seeing a lot of content, and also there's an art in making players believe that there's, they've only explored sort of 60% of the game, and really they've explored 90%. That you give the impression that there's a bigger world out there, there's a world working and existing whether they're in it or not, and there's a real art to creating that world. I don't know, you just kind of get used to it, really, I guess. I mean, there's certainly in other disciplines other than poetry, you do end up creating a lot of drafts and things like that, and a lot of, certainly in TV, where story bibles and character bibles are used quite a lot. You just get used to the form, and writing is rewriting, and nowhere has that been more the case in the games, because you have to continually, the gameplay is continually changing, the levels are continually changing, and your script has to react and be flexible with that. And so that means that if a writer is kind of just brought on for a specific amount of time and then they're sort of kicked out the door because their contract's up, then you've got a script that suddenly designers have to start tinkering around with it because the writer's not there and suddenly things have changed. And it's actually having someone there holding onto the narrative strings, because everything will try to pull narrative apart. The changes in gameplay, level design, sound, losing levels, losing characters, they all have an impact on that structure. And that's one thing writers really understand, structure. And many people think they understand story and they understand writing when kind of what they can do is write and they can have ideas. But what they don't understand is structure and how important that is. And when you're building a narrative over sort of 10, 12, 14, whatever hours, structure becomes so important. So when structure gets disrupted because of something that's happened here in the game, as a writer that's going to happen, that's going to affect a plot point, and you can see it because you can see the whole structure in your head, and lots of other disciplines can't see that structure because they've not been trained to do it. And that's again why stories and games can go so wrong, because the structure gets messed about because of things like budget constraints and time constraints, and so levels get cut, etc. And that can be brutal on script and creativity. And so you've got to kind of make sure you get in early, getting in early and come out late.
Yeah, definitely that point you make there about the change in structure. I think there's a key talent that I think every writer should have, but certainly games writers definitely should have, is that ability to be able to see the entire, almost like the music, the rhythm of a scene. When you look at a structure and you go, there's a narrative beat missing here. We need an emotional moment where the hero pines over the loss of his dog or something, or writes a letter to his mum. You need to have that moment to hit that right narrative beat, and then you might not be able to get that because the scene's removed, and suddenly you're thinking the story's lacking something. So how do you move things from here or there? How do you tweak stuff a little bit to make sure you still have that narrative beat, that you still get the right kind of development of emotion through the story, the hero's journey through the narrative, and still hit all the right points and have it be a fulfilling story. And sometimes that's something that we lose. You were talking about the tree before. People often think that the choices in a game are kind of like 2 branches and then 2 more branches and then branching and branching and branching, so you have this tree sort of thing. But the truth is most games aren't like that. Because if you did that, most players, if here's the tree in front of you, most players are going to pick this thing and they're going to go up this side of it, and all of this is not going to be seen. And if you're making a game, you don't want to be wasting time making all these assets that maybe only 10% of the people who play are going to play. So what we have is what we call tree and vine structure, which is where you tend to have a central narrative that more or less goes up here, but it will branch off and come back. So you two could be having a conversation about the same game, and you could say, oh, when you blew up the bad guy's headquarters, did you steal the helicopter or take the speedboat? And you took the helicopter and you had a little different bit, and then you come back to and then you met at the canyon, and you stole the speedboat and you had another thing, but you met at the canyon. So you'd have the bad guy's headquarters scene and the canyon scene would be in common, but the little bit with the speedboat and the helicopter would be completely different from you. And if we conjure it in the right kind of way, it gives you the sense of a larger world, the smoke and mirrors thing again. That's the dirty little secret of games design, is we make you think you have more control than you actually do. And half of that art is the ability for us to sort of get past the fact that we don't have the technology to give you a truly open world. But as long as we give you the impression of one, and as long as you feel, as long as you're sold on that idea and you're immersed in the game, then we're doing our job. Yes, sir.
It sounds like story always has to take the backseat to the actual gameplay. Are there any examples of games where somebody has had an idea for a story and thought, gaming is the best medium I can tell this in, and then there's been a game from that?
Well, I know. The most popular question that I get asked is like, I've got a great idea for a video game story. I've written this video game story. How do I get it made? And unfortunately, it doesn't work like that in games. With movies, sure, you can write a screenplay, you can shop it around. You might get it made if you're lucky. That's not how it works in games. In games, the ideas are generated internally by the developers, by the publishers, or publishers might have a particular intellectual property that they allocate to a developer. but it doesn't come from an individual rocking up to a developer's door and saying, hey, I've got my great idea. It does not work that way. It can, with the flourishing indie scene, with things like Unity and Game Maker, there are more avenues to make that game yourself and to assemble a team, with things like Kickstarter, with modding and fan forums and stuff. You can find other ways to make that great game. But usually you just have to kind of get in with a developer and work your way up to a point when people actually listen to your ideas. So, and I think maybe you could get that done if you were sort of a big name, like I know sort of people like Jordan Mechner can go to developers and publishers with a great idea, but then they've got a big pedigree behind them. It is a popular misconception that that's how kind of games work, and that mine and Jim's job involves coming up with a great idea and then finding a developer to make it, and that would be great if that was the case, but it's much more a collaborative process, and you never kind of know what you're going to get from developer to developer, from game to game, and it all depends on when you're brought on board with the game, how seriously the team takes narrative, whether it's a narrative-heavy game, and you'll sort of be slid across a box of narrative parts that they put together. With something like Tomb Raider, there was a synopsis about 4 or 5 pages, and there was a character bio of some of the characters. We also had some of the secondary characters were visual as well. They'd already been fleshed out and were at that time intended on being multiplayer characters as well, so we're going to tell their story in multiplayer, but that didn't actually happen. And then I sort of just fleshed it all out and sort of built out from that synopsis and did it in quite a sort of traditional filmic way, I guess. So broadening out the treatment in, so the synopsis into a broader treatment into something that we call a micro, I think it was a micro script or macro script, I can't remember, where we fleshed out every scene and looked at the animation that was needed for it, the lengths of it, and then actually going and writing a sort of 3-act structure script for it. On other games, it has literally been, they've kind of got a sort of idea, like with Overlord they had an idea they wanted to theme the levels around the 7 deadly sins. They kind of worked out a couple of them. They sort of worked out a couple of characters. They had a few sort of visuals that didn't have any character to them. And then I had to sort of fill in the rest. So you kind of never know what you're going to get from project to project. And it is a kind of, a Dr. Frankenstein role of just pulling the body parts together and sort of sewing it together and kind of making it human.
Move my creation. Yeah, before the day when we've done like Rise workshops, is you'll often get someone go, I've got a great idea for a video game, to which my answer always has to be, yeah, no one cares, sadly. Because as Rhys says, you may have a great idea for a video game, but the truth is, as much as we want to put good story into a narrative into great games, nobody comes to a video game for the narrative. People come to games for games. And what we do is with a great narrative, you can take a good game and make it great with an excellent narrative. You can raise the quality of it so that you can raise the quality of the experience. But unless you're somebody who's high up in the industry, you can't just walk in through the front door and go, I've got this great idea. To give you an example of the way, sometimes the purely mechanical, very, very cynical way that it's put together. When I was working on Maelstrom, the real-time strategy game, they brought me in, they said, okay, well, we've got this company that we worked with, did a sci-fi real-time strategy game for us, and they've got this really great software engine that renders water, the movement of water from high levels to low levels. So we've got this idea about a real-time strategy game where you can use water as a weapon. So if you had a lake up here, you could blow a hole in the wall and it would flood the city underneath, and that was their cool key concept. And they said, we did a focus group and we found out that kids really like Transformers, Starship Troopers, and Mad Max. So those are the 3 factions you're going to have in your real-time strategy game. Guys who have Transformers, like the bugs from Starship Troopers, and a bunch of Mad Max guys. And they had a whole load of character art, and they said, these are the characters, we did a focus group, here are the characters that everybody liked. These are your lead characters. We want 20 missions and a story, go. And that toolbox was laid down in front of me. And and it's a pretty cynical kind of process, and I tried my best to produce a game, and then they cut half of the missions, and it all went crazy, and I ended up doing my own voice acting. But that's often the way the process works. It will be led by somebody at the studio saying, well, here is the technology that we have, here is a concept for the style of game we want to produce, and that work will be done before a writer is called in to add their energy to the project. So, sadly, if you've got a great idea for a game, you're going to have to sit on it for a while before you'll be able to be in a position to present it. With indie technology becoming easier and for people to get hold of, I think there's going to come a time where people will be able to sit down and say, well, I've got a story I want to express, and I could write a novel, or I could write a comic book, or I could write a game. I think we're just at the point now where that's starting to be something that you could express, but it wouldn't be a AAA blockbuster, it would be a small kind of personal project.
I disagree slightly on that. I do think some players come to games for story. I think they come to specific games for story, but not all games. I certainly
like
I hear enough players sort of saying, well, I like particularly story-heavy games, and I think players are rating story kind of quite highly these days.
Well, maybe more so now. Maybe I'm being too harsh about it.
A game still has to have a good game to it, but I think with the likes of stuff like the Bioshocks and the Portals as well, the story has become so important that I think people do. I came to Half-Life episodes because of the story of the first game. The gameplay is enjoyable and that helps, but story hooks the players in, and the characters in particular wanting to know what happened, and certainly I found that with Deus Ex. I enjoyed the gameplay, but I was really interested to see what happened with the characters.
Yeah, but then you're a writer though, so you probably would be attracted to that.
I don't think, but I was a gamer first.
That's true.
But certainly, the amount that players and the press are talking about story now, I think it is more important to players than perhaps publishers really recognise.
I agree with that, definitely.
There's actually there's numbers to support that. There's in the top 3 decision making for whether you buy a game or not. Story, graphics, and genre are the 3 top things.
Well, that's
obviously it's not going to be like the Bejeweled story.
Yeah.
It's a great narrative.
Yeah, it's a great narrative. It always resolves itself. But that's I think the difference here is people get there to experience a story, which is actually different from reading sort of linear thing. And a common misconception about people trying to get into games is they want to tell their linear story through a game, as opposed to marrying the parts into making an experience that involves the story, but also you care for a character not only because it's written well, but also because it's graphically done well, it's set well, it's timed well, it's put in a level that's consistent, it's put in a rhythm that's consistent. And I think that is something that a lot of people don't see when they talk about story. That's actually more like the film, really.
I mean, I've always felt that the way I always try to describe it to people who are non-gamers is that if you read a book, see a play, watch a movie, narrative's delivered to you. So you are essentially, it doesn't matter how much you identify with the character in the story, you are essentially a passive consumer of narrative. I am the writer. You read a scene in the book where it says, he walked into the room and saw the glass. That's me saying, here's the glass, take a look. This is what I want you to look at. This is part of the narrative. If it's a game, you're the character. You walk in the room. There's a bunch of items on the table here. There's the pen, there's this, there's the glass, there's all these different items. You as the player will discover the glass. You have discovered that piece of narrative. It's not been given to you. And because you discover it, I think that as a gamer, you take ownership of the story in a completely different way from the way you would if you were a passive consumer of it. And that makes it personal in a way that no other medium can, which is, I think, is one of the greatest things about being a games writer, is we have the ability to reach our audience in a very unique and personal way, I think.
I mean, it's also, again, the invisible storytelling. One of my little personal bugbears is when people go on about, yes, but the best stories are the ones that players tell themselves, as if the writer or narrative designer or whoever is in charge of that hasn't thought about that. You still put kind of milestones in. You still understand the experience of play. You still put in the big epic levels to make them kind of feel small and lonely. or you kind of, like you were talking about the glass, there's a really nice, I think it's in the first Bioshock game where when they're introducing the Houdini splicer, and they get you to look in a certain area by putting some dollars or something there, so they know the player's going to be looking at that particular thing, and then they put an interesting shrine there. And then you hear the laughter, and you turn around and the Houdini splicer's just behind you, and it's such a great introduction to it, and they use gameplay to do that. But there's also been that was an engineered moment that happened, and a lot of those kind of moments where you are filling in the gaps, and Bioshock is a great example of that, because it uses things like mise-en-scène, the placement on the stage of when you go into a room and you can see the dead bodies and how they're placed. Maybe you hear an audio diary and you start to figure out kind of what happened and how they met their fate, and that's all been thought of. But you're sort of filling in the gaps, but it's not like those gaps weren't thought about.
Sometimes those gaps are deliberately engineered for you to fill them in, because it's like, okay, I'll parcel out these elements of story, but I want the player to fill these particular empty spaces, because those are the spaces that will make you connect and resonate strongly at that point with the character or the environment that you're in.
You're also taking into consideration the type of player that you're dealing with. Ken Levine talks about sort of three stages of narrative with the first Bioshock. So you've got the core storyline that players that just want the real kind of fast experience, lots of combat, lots of gunplay, but they still want to understand the story, and that's that core golden path for them. And then the players that want to poke around a bit in the world and discover a few things, well, then there's narrative that kind of rewards them, there's encounters that reward them, and then there's the sort of completionist players that want to poke around in every single nook and cranny, and then they find the obscure audio diaries, and then they find the kind of little side stories, and then they kind of, it feels personal, it feels you've discovered it, even though it's been put there deliberately for you to discover.
That's reminding me. We did one of the things we did on Deus Ex. We had a guy whose sole job was to write the emails you would find on people's computers, and he did go a little bit stir crazy towards the end. But no, I didn't do that. No, I did the ebooks. I did a lot of the ebooks. But he wrote this great scene where there's one level where you're moving through a laboratory, and you hack one computer and you find a guy saying, "I think they're onto us. I think, so-and-so saw us in the lab last night, what are we going to do?" And then you find the other computer, and it's someone saying, "Well, my husband can't know." And it's two people having an affair. And then what are we going to do about that guy? And they name this other guy. And then you find his computer, and he goes, "I observed these two people walking into the laboratory. I think they're stealing supplies." And they're actually shagging in the closet. And I love the idea of that, because you never meet any of those three people in the game, because it's nighttime, everybody's gone home. But I love the idea that you get the impression that there's a whole little drama going on here that you're never going to see, you're never going to be connected with, but it gives you the sense that there's an ongoing world out there. We had a question at the back.
I'm noticing a lot of parallels between what you're describing in terms of writing for video games and some of the game design challenges we've been having in role-playing games. Particularly with some of the larger, more structured events where you can't just adapt things on the fly. I'm thinking of what you were saying about having to give the players choices, but sort of telling a compelling narrative, between leaving spaces for the players to fill in, spaces where you have to drive the plot. Situations where sometimes the technical engine you've been given is the most important determinant. If you're writing a particular system or a particular style, and you can't change that. And I'm just wondering, in the role-playing game design, there's been a movement towards more narrative-driven games and more narrative-driven stories, which has taken some people by surprise. I've been noticing a similar sort of trend in some of the more independent computer game designs. Some of the less blockbuster titles are very much narrative-driven stories, and in some cases the game engine is it's narrative driven because the game engine isn't very good, and they don't have a particular edge there. And also some independent producers who are producing games that are essentially all narrative, and where the game engine is secondary at best. I was wondering if you've seen that kind of parallel yourself, or if I'm totally off base.
Well, I think certainly as somebody who comes from, I was a pencil and paper gamer for a very long time, both as a player and a GM, and definitely years of doing that, I'm drawing on that when I'm writing stuff for whatever games I'm working on. I see you sitting in the front row with a Cyberpunk t-shirt on, and I'm thinking very much of that game. That was a game I GM'd at for years, and I very much drew on my experiences of that and of playing like, you know, Dungeons & Dragons and Star Frontiers and Traveller and all those kind of things as a GM and as a player, and I think I still do as a game writer. But as for the question of the sort of narrative balance, I think we're at a stage where the technology of the industry is allowing us to support both of those things. So you can have narrative light stories that still can tell a decent story. You can have narrative heavy stories that will still work as a game. And I think that the idea of like using narrative to kind of perhaps patch the failure in your technology. A good example is, this is a horrible thing to say because it makes it sound like it's not a very good game. Thomas Was Alone. Anybody played that? This is, it's a lovely little game on its own. It's a great little puzzle title, and if you just didn't have any narrative at all, it would still be a great little game. But there's this peculiar little quirky storyline that just totally made me fall in love with it. And it really is a great example of a not particularly dense narrative, but just a really well pitched one, raising what could be what is a good game into being a great game. And I think that's kind of one of the strengths of what we can do in this industry.
I really hate Portal did the same thing.
Yeah, that's another good example.
But I mean, I wish I could spend more time looking at indie games myself, because I think there's some really interesting things going on there. And I think, is it Twine that uses, that's all kind of narrative based, sort of almost creating narrative trees and things. I think technology and realism can only take you so far. I think now we're kind of looking at publishers, across the board, are looking at upping their storytelling. Particularly looking at things like performance and emotion and character. I think, and one thing that certainly, games like The Last of Us and Tomb Raider as well have helped show is how much players invest in characters, and The Walking Dead as well. I mean, that was kind of virtually all character driven. I know you're not a big fan of that, but
but certainly in terms of character and narrative, it's very strong.
And it was powerful because you invested in those characters, and so I think there's a lot more focus on that now, and that was when we were putting Tomb Raider together, it was very much Lara's journey and Lara's character evolving, and you being in the character's shoes, either sort of feeling like you were that character or that you were kind of helping that character in a way. I mean, I'm not going to, various things have been said about Lara and Claire's relationship to Lara, and personally I always inhabit a character and I am that character, but through things like focus testing, we've come to realise that actually players have very different relationships with characters, and they can feel like they are looking after a character, guiding a character, dare I say it, protecting a character, or they can feel that they are that character, and it's kind of still creating compelling, interesting experiences for that. And I don't think, we knew they invested in character when we started out with Tomb Raider, but we didn't kind of realise how much they invested, and it really had some very interesting sort of feedback and sort of I guess you could call it positive fallout from people that have been very affected by Lara's journey and her ability to kind of pick herself up and take one step at a time, in that the story we wanted to tell about the endurance of the human spirit. And there have been people who've gone through very dark times in their life who had been sort of kind of given sort of moments of hope and joy through that, and that's something you can never kind of account for, but just it shows you the power of game storytelling. And also another interesting thing with Tomb Raider and Claire's reactions to that character is Lara was put into a difficult situation with a gentleman that probably many of you have read about on the internet. And it was a sexually threatening scene. It doesn't go in that direction, but there's a threat there, and Lara deals with it. And some of the most interesting feedback we had was from male players saying, I never knew what it was like. I never understood what it was like to be a woman and to feel that kind of threat, because I wouldn't have, I'd be unlikely to experience that as a guy in the real world. But actually feeling that through a games character gave me a whole new perspective on it, and I thought you couldn't engineer that. We never thought about that, but it was sort of fortuitous and kind of wonderful, and it shows you why game storytelling can work so well, and why it's sometimes the only way to experience a story and a character like that.
God, it's awesome when you get to do that. I love stories like that, when hearing about people when you can open up a moment of experience, when you can truly transport somebody. Because the holy grail that we have as game writers is immersion. We want you to be there. We want you to inhabit those characters, to feel like that world is really happening around you. And everybody jokes about, picking up a controller and then looking at the watch and finding out it's 4 a.m. And that's what we want. We want you to be dragged in there. We want you to inhabit those worlds. And if we can do it right, it's so rewarding when somebody says something like that. So I think we had a question over here.
As a writer, what's it like to try and integrate the mechanics of a game with the narrative in a meaningful way?
It depends. Sometimes that's kind of a how long is a piece of string question, really. I guess it would depend really on the kind of game that you're producing. If you have, let's say if it's like a racing car game, and the game's mostly about you being in a car, and let's say it doesn't have any character models, so it's all about, you never see any people in this car racing game. How do you inject narrative into that if you can't show any human beings? If all you've got is voice dialogue, then you have to change the way that you approach something. It could be it's usually technical limitations, where you can't block a scene in a particular way. I'm thinking of one just off the top of my head from Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. There's a scene where one of the characters gets out of the back seat of a limo, which you can't do in the game. You can drive the limo, you get in the front seat of a limo and drive a limo around, but you never see someone getting out of the back seat of a limo, so how do you block that shot? And the way they did it is they just have the limo come up in front of the camera, and you hear the sound of a door opening and closing, the limo drives away and the guy's standing there. And subconsciously you think, oh yeah, that's how they did that. That's a tiny little technical limitation. But somebody had to sit there and think, how do I shoot that scene? How do I deliver that bit of narrative with this technical limitation? That's a small example. If you have a game like going back to When Thomas Was Alone, that's a game that doesn't have any human characters in it at all. How do you deliver narrative through that? So it's a question of what the game is. You'd have to know what that is before you could say, okay, here are the limitations. Whether you can do small details or large details. Using computer technology, it's easier for you to render, let's say, 1,000 bad guys coming over a hill and attacking a base than it is for you to render something where I hand a piece of paper to Rhi and she takes it from me, because that kind of animation is extremely labour intensive. And yet if you were making a movie, all you'd have to do is point a camera at 2 actors and it's as easy as that. Whereas if you were making a feature film and you want to show 1,000 guys coming over a hill, that's going to blow your special effects budget. So it's the strange economies of scale that you apply to narrative can work in kind of cart before horse sometimes in gaming.
And you also become aware of there's limitations of budget, limitations of tech, limitations of time. So you get used to things like the fact that touching cloth is very animation intensive, therefore very budget intensive.
Hair's another one.
Water, big crowds, moving fabric. You can't do big crowd scenes if the engine you're writing for can't render big crowd scenes. So you have to kind of, even if you're doing very cinematics, what would seem to be easy linear storytelling in some ways, you're still having to factor in that. You're still having to factor in what's happening in the game around those scenes, what are the entry and the exit points, and how you're going to make the most use of a scene where you've got to spend at least half of it telling the player what they've done and what they've got to do next. And so even with something that looks straightforward and filmic, it's that there's still a lot going on that's very unique to the medium and to the game surrounding it.
What she said.
What I wanted to ask you, you said you'd be quite interested, maybe tongue-in-cheek, about just writing the narrative for a really silly, fast car game. If a publisher or a studio were to approach you asking for a narrative for that, how would you begin to approach the overall narrative?
I was approached to work on a very high-profile racing game franchise, and they wanted to do, they wanted to steer away from the tone of it, which was very, very glittery, very shiny, very fast and furious kind of sort of style racing game. They wanted to do something very gritty. We talked about Bullet, that movie, as a touchstone for it. So, and it was going to be really dark, and it was going to have like, you know, they said we wanted to be like a David Fincher movie. We wanted it to be sort of like, you know, really deep blacks on everything, and you know, gloomy and all that. And I was like, man, I'm totally all over that because I love David Fincher's movies. I can totally do that. And when the game was released, it's a glittery, fast and the furious, shiny thing that doesn't have any people in it at all. So, because basically they realised that's too much like hard work. And the audience of that kind of game don't really want a deep narrative. So, sadly, that's the way those sort of things often go.
That's probably one of the most difficult, brutal, creative things I've had to go through in my career, which is Mirror's Edge. And Mirror's Edge sort of suffered a bit at the start because the whole game had been designed by the time I was brought on board, and they'd had some problems looking for a writer, and so I came in, and so it had all its levels. They'd been put together with no story in mind, and that meant that, you know, I had to. It's working backwards. It's like this is where the action's got to kind of go, and now you've got to work out what the action is that sort of leads it there, and why she's going from the boat to the stop, from the skyscraper to sewers and things like that. So that is a challenge in of itself, but that's actually. It's a kind of workable challenge, and you get that a bit on most games in that by the time they're getting writers, they've usually got a few levels in mind. And if they've left narrative space, then all the better. And then with Mirror's Edge, it's a first-person game, but we had Faith speaking while she's running along during levels. We had her speaking to Merc, who is the voice in her ear, who's her tracker, who's helping her along, and also speaking to other characters in the world. And then the 11th hour, they decided that they didn't want Faith speaking in levels at all, and they found it was too distracting for players, and so they were only going to have her speaking in cutscenes, and they took out all of Faith's level dialogue and all the dialogue of other characters speaking to her, and even in places like elevators and things like that, where it's quiet and she wasn't actually doing much moving. Now I understand why, when you're having a first-person perspective, having a disembodied voice can be a little bit weird. But the fact was that the script had been designed to have level dialogue as part of the storytelling. And so sort of ripping all that out made the story and kind of incomplete. And that, I've never had anything quite as brutal as that happen before, but that was lost about 50% of the script because of that. And it was, the narrative became shallower and more unbalanced and less deep because this whole load of storytelling had been taken out. And you don't have to have storytelling through level dialogue or that kind of thing. But when you design it like that and you take it out, it doesn't work. You have to structure your narrative, to meet the needs of your level design at the time. And kind of it was. If they'd done it early on, then it would have been structured quite differently to just sort of ripping it out at the end. So that's probably the most brutal example that I've had. What's yours? What's your pain?
When we were working on Fable: The Journey, I was working with another writer called Martin Corder, and we had a lot of. It's very much a kind of like Blackadder-esque, Monty Python-esque sort of like pseudo fantasy world. And we had an absolute blast writing the script because we would write stuff, and you always know when something's funny when you come back to the joke 4 or 5 times and it still makes you laugh. And we had some great gags that we loved so much. And it went to Microsoft Seattle and nobody got it. And I'm convinced to this day that it was a culture clash because it was read by a team of Americans who didn't get the humour. And Fable is very British humour. And they came back and said, this isn't funny. And it's like, no, it's not funny to you. But everybody in the studio, we read this stuff out loud. And we would read the dialogue out loud to the guys in meetings, and everybody would be rolling around. And we were like, we've got a winner here, this is really, really funny. I'd never really done comedy before, and certainly not anything as sustained as this in a games medium. And I was really proud of the work that Martin and I did. And sadly, the game's still okay, but there was stuff in there that was just, I thought was eye-wateringly hilarious that I was really, really proud of. And that was kind of, it wasn't brutally ripped out like your stuff was with Mirror's Edge. In a way, it was almost kind of worse because it was nibbled away little by little. And it was like watching something I loved just slowly fading and fading and fading and fading. And that was quite saddening. We all have war stories. We all have a big collection of war stories, but that's the nature of working in, I guess, in any industry.
You said before that technology is not yet there for open world. Would it be like a dream come true for you, or your worst nightmare? And actually, maybe you were involved in a project that promised that to you, and then obviously failed.
I guess you'd need to come up with a device. If you could come up with a technology that could generate narrative, you still need a writer in there at least at some point just to kind of set the dial spinning, to create the kind of, or maybe to create the starting conditions for that world. In a way, it's a great idea and a terrifying idea because I look at it and think, God, that would put me out of a job. But I would love to see, I'd love to see an AI engine where I could say, okay, flip a set of switches and go, there's your world, and go, and then see what popped out. Because I think even then, maybe you probably still need a writer in the mix if it was like an ongoing thing, like an MMO. Maybe it would spontaneously generate a scenario. I think maybe you might still need a writer to kind of lean in and go, just tweak that, fix this a little bit. Or I think the only thing that's quite close to that right now would be something like, say, maybe EVE Online, where it's not the game system that's generating the narrative, it's the players generating the narrative, because EVE is basically they build a world and go, you guys, off you go, do whatever you like. And I don't think that really has somebody, I don't think there's any like games master in there kind of pulling or pushing the narrative. So I'd like to see that, but I fear the day that comes true because I'll have to find something else to do.
Yeah, I think there's been some interesting examples. One that I used to play was called A Tale in the Desert, and it was set in ancient Egypt. And it was, you started off building bricks and sort of slowly moved up to pyramids, and you were kind of farming camels and making pots, and it was all kind of peaceful. But they had the developers called eGenesis took on various character personas in the game. One of them played the Pharaoh, and I think actually the same guy played something called the Stranger as well. And the Stranger would kind of come in every now and then and introduce kind of a piece of tech or concept into the game that would sort of shake things up.
Was this like a live running game?
Yeah, it was an MMO.
Oh, cool.
And things like marijuana or slavery or werewolves or things like that, just to kind of see what the players did and how they reacted to that. But sometimes like creating the sense of an open world is quite interesting as well. Like I've been addicted to Animal Crossing recently, and that's great at creating a kind of world that you totally feel is happening without you. And that sort of, people, it's amazing that the things that pop up and the kind of little experiences you get. And I'd really love to see how that kind of was structured narratively, because it always feels so sort of personal to everyone that plays it.
I think we've got time for maybe one more question.
When you talk about the game that you did, or that you did a lot of, you even said we produced the game, we did this, it seems like you feel you do sort of have ownership over the game.
Oh, definitely.
And what's the sort of emotional involvement in that? I'm really interested to see, because I'm sort of getting into the shoes for the first time, because usually we get writers on at the last second because why pay them earlier? It's the least, from a development standpoint, if you don't do a AAA title, it's often the least useful investment to get them in, either very early on and then later on, because in the middle there's a whole lot of time spent doing stuff where we don't need a writer for.
That is true. If you charted the way I worked on the game, it would look like a sine wave. Yeah. So like, I came in early, I was here, and then it's like, okay, this is all technical stuff for the next 3 months, we don't need you. So I go off and do something else. And then it'll be, okay, now we've developed a stage where we're building levels, we need you to come back in. And now we don't need you, and now we need you, and now we don't need you. And I think that's, a lot of games companies will say, well, if you want to be a writer for us, you have to be in the office every day, and you have to be there, walking the floor. And I don't think you do. I think maybe some projects will need you there for a while.
Someone like that. So even though you were in like that, Mary was.
But you need, but that's the job of the. That's not technically that's not necessarily the job of a writer. That's the job.
She was holding on to the strings.
Right. Yeah. But that's the job of the narrative lead. Is the person who doesn't necessarily have to be a writer, but as I said earlier to you about the person who holds the concept of the story in their head.
But that's not always there.
But that's not always there. You need a cheerleader for narrative, whether that's a person who that's their job or it's somebody else doing another job and they happen to take that on. You need somebody who's always bearing narrative in mind. whether that's a narrative lead or whatever, you don't always need a writer in the room. Sometimes it's actually counterproductive if you've got a writer there trying to work on script and everybody's coming in and saying, can you change this, can you change this? Like, you need to put them away in a box where they can write and come back and bring the script to you and go through that iterative process.
Sort of checking in, and so many companies don't use them at the start, where they can be most useful for actually working hand in hand with designers at the start and sort of creating the world and the mechanics and the Bibles and things like that. Because with Overlord, I worked very closely with the level designers, each individual level, working with them, seeing what their vision was, seeing what needed to be told for a story, where the space was to do it, and we'd go back and forth constructing a script that worked narratively for what I wanted, that worked for their level. By the time that it was recorded and it came to be dropped into that level, it worked, and they'd had that involvement, they'd had that investment. And so I don't like writers being in boxes. I do like writers to be involved in with the rest of the team. And I think sometimes bad things happen when writers are put in boxes and like the designers or the audio people have nothing to do with them. It should be integrated into design.
I agree with that. I mean, the point you made about writing being the cheap part of the process is totally true. It's a hell of a lot easier to change a couple of lines of dialogue on the script, but that's why you should have a writer in early, because I think anybody who understands the way the writing process works knows that when they come in on day one, the script that they're writing today will not be the script that will be coming out 3 or 4 years down the line when the process is finished. Sometimes you'll get studios who will use writers who perhaps aren't game savvy. I mean, there's a bugbear that we always talk about is a lot of time people go, oh, we're going to get a Hollywood screenwriter to do this. It's like, no, that's the wrong tool for the wrong job. Hollywood screenwriter, he may be great at doing a feature film, but he's not a gamer. He doesn't understand. He'll deliver you a narrative and go, check please, and walk away. That's not what you need. You need somebody who will be there, who will write it for you, go away, and you go, now come back in and change it for me. Go away again, now come back in and change it for me, and be there for that iterative process all the way through from maybe not day one, but maybe day 10 through to kind of the very end of the process. And because what we do is resource cheap, if you're invested from an early standpoint, you can continue to come back and change things. It only becomes resource expensive when you pay a guy to do one job and they walk away, and then you have to pay another guy to come in and fix it. So that's why I think we're both proponents of if you get a writer in early, it pays off late.